Dan, you're muted.
Thank you. I want to consider this morning the story of Elijah. This is the story that we frequently quote when we talk about the still small voice of God. But we usually just take that phrase and don't really think about how we came to it. So Elijah has kind of a complicated story. It begins in the 16th chapter of the book of First Kings. And it begins in this way. Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight more than any of his predecessors. It was not enough for him to follow the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He even married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. Ahab set up an altar to Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and also made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than any of the kings of Israel before him. So what that passage manages to obscure is that at this time that it's talking about, there were two kingdoms of Israel, the northern kingdom, also known as Samaria, and the southern kingdom known as Judah. And they had divided. In the northern kingdom, Samaria was trying to increase its power. So Ahab's marriage with Jezebel was an attempt to form an alliance with the Sidonians. And by doing so, to gain access to the economic wealth of Sidon and Tyre, which were on the Mediterranean and had a vast trading network. And so this alliance helped Samaria become much wealthier. It also enabled the wealthy people of Israel to gain more and more control over the poor, to dispossess them from their land, and created a time of great economic inequality, something that was never pleasing to God if you read through any of the prophets. But in addition, one of the differences between Samaria and Sidon was that as a city of the coast, the Sidonians were used to very fertile agriculture. They had a lot of rain, their fields were green, they had fertile soil, and Baal and Asherah were the god and goddess in charge of rain and fertility. The Israelites lived in the much less fertile hill country. And so when Ahab and Jezebel made this diplomatic pact in a way, it would have made sense for both Ahab and Jezebel, looking at the agricultural wealth of Sidon, to say, well, those Sidonian fertility gods are taking care of Sidon and Tyre pretty well. So why don't we import their worship into Israel, build them a temple, bring out all of these priests of Baal to Samaria, and the priests of Asherah, and get some of that wealth for ourselves, making the assumption that the wealth of Sidon was being created by the god of rain and fertility. This was when Elijah came forward to Ahab and said, what you're doing is enraging God, and as a sign of how angry God is with you, there will be no more rain in Israel until I say so. And then he disappeared. So you can see that what is kind of disguised in the text between 1 Kings 16 through 19 is that when Elijah says there will be no more rain until I say so, he's directly attacking the power center of Baal, because that is rain. And so when he says to Ahab, and by extension Jezebel, to heck with your false gods of rain and fertility, it's really Yahweh who has this power. And just to prove it, there will be a drought, even though you've imported 400 priests for Baal, and then vanishes. He has really attacked kind of the center of their economic and religious enterprise. And he disappears into the desert, and there are stories about what happens to him in the desert. And the long and the short of it is that there is a drought for 3 years. No rain at all comes to Israel. And when the Israeli situation is just totally and completely desperate, and after Jezebel, in the second year of the drought, has gone out and killed all of Yahweh's other prophets, except for Elijah, who is in hiding, so that he's the only prophet left. Elijah appears out of nowhere to Ahab when Ahab is walking along the dusty ground, and says, okay, do you acknowledge now that that Yahweh is a true God and Baal is a false god? And Ahab is not ready to acknowledge it. And Elijah says, well, there will be rain now, but I need you to send all of the prophets of Baal up to the mountain, and we will have a contest, because if God can cause rain, God can also cause fire. And all of the prophets of Baal, 450 of them, go up to the mountain, and Elijah goes up to the mountain, and each party, so to speak, sacrifices a bull. And Elijah says, okay, now have Baal set your sacrifice on fire. They've laid it on a bunch of stones, on a bunch of wood. They walk around, they dance around, they call upon Baal, and this goes on for hours and hours, and their bull is not lit on fire. Elijah, on the other hand, has been rebuilding an altar to Yahweh that had been set up on the mountain that Jezebel had torn down, and he rebuilds it. He puts his wood on the altar. He puts the pieces of wool on top of the wood. He has asked for all of Israel to be gathered around to see this spectacle. And he calls the people and he says, bring some water from the sea and pour it over the bull and the wood and the altar. And they bring so much water, and he asks them again and again until the entire sacrifice, the wood, the altar are all drenched with water. And he calls on God to accept the sacrifice, and a bolt of lightning and fire comes down from on high and consumes the bull, consumes the wood, consumes the he says to the people of Israel, now who do you believe? Do you believe in Yahweh or do you believe in Baal? And they say, Yahweh. And he says, then kill the prophets of Baal. And the people set upon these 450 prophets, and they kill them all and roll them down the hillside into the sea. And then he says, go home. And everybody disappears. And he waits on the mountain more or less alone. He has a young boy he grabs from the crowd who is waiting there with him. And a cloud comes up from way off on the horizon of the ocean and moves towards Israel and inundates the entire place with rain. And it rains and it rains and it rains. And Ahab goes and tells Jezebel that all of her prophets have been killed. And this is where we pick up the story in the 19th, I believe it's the 19th chapter of First Kings. And I'm going to read from that for a while. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, that he had murdered all the prophets by the sword. Jezebel then sent a messenger to Elijah and said, may the gods do thus to me and more, if by this time tomorrow I have not done with your life what was done to each of them. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life, going to Beersheba of Judah. He left his servant there and went a day's journey into the wilderness until he came to a solitary broom tree and sat beneath it. He prayed for death. Enough, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. He lay down and fell asleep under the solitary broom tree, but suddenly an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a hearth cake and a jug of water. After he ate and drank, he lay down again. But the angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him, and said, get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you. He got up, ate and drank. Then, strengthened by that food, he walked 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain of God, Horeb. There he came to a cave where he took shelter. But the word of the Lord came to him, why are you here, Elijah? He answered, I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, but the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They have destroyed your altars and murdered your prophets by the sword. I alone remain, and they seek to take my life. Then the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Why are you here? He replied, I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, but the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They have destroyed your altars and murdered your prophets by the sword. I alone remain, and they seek to take my life. The Lord said to him, go back, take the desert road to Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king of Aram, You shall also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king of Israel, and Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel Mahola, as prophet to succeed you. So there are a lot of things that we don't ask ourselves about this story. And the first one, I think, is what does it actually mean that the earthquake and the wind and the fire are not where God's voice is found? And I think what it may mean is that despite the human tendency to think of natural disasters as punishment from God, unless God declares them beforehand to be so, they are not. And if we think that this is a really ancient tendency, all we have to do is look at all of the pastors who said about Hurricane Katrina that was God's punishment upon an immoral city, or the number of people who have said that this disease is a plague upon immoral people or an immoral continent, or that this place is destroyed by earthquake because they've displeased God. This is an ongoing and continuing effort to make natural disasters a word from God that I think God in this passage is saying they are not. Now, you could say, well, but what about the drought? And I think what you can say about the drought is God specifically said beforehand there will be a drought, and it was a strategic drought aimed at a very specific kind of usurpation of God's power, so to speak. I would not quote me on this idea that God is renouncing natural disasters as a tool for communication here, but I think that this is implied. It's not these big, huge things that we want to say God is talking through this horrible catastrophe. It is something much smaller and not a physical sign like that. And I think when we talk about what does it mean to hear the voice of God, in some ways it depends on what God wants to say. So right here, what God wants to say is to comfort Elijah and to give him a plan of action, because he's paralyzed and he doesn't know what to do. He's afraid that Jezebel is going to have him killed. He's afraid that he has no more recourse for turning the people of Israel back to the worship of Yahweh. So God is trying to speak to him here, to Elijah here, to say, here's what you can do. But there are all kinds of other ways that God might speak, depending on what God's purpose might be. I think that God speaks through beauty and awe. God speaks through compassion and kindness and care. So if what God wants to communicate to me is God's love for me, it doesn't necessarily have to come in a voice from out of the silence. It can come through somebody's hug or phone call or patting me on the back or smile. I think what I'm saying is that God does a lot of speaking without words, or at least a lot of communicating without words. But there are times when people talk about hearing the voice of God this used to get me so frustrated. People would say, well, I was in prayer and God said to me, and I wanted to say, how did God say it to you? Did God write it on a wall? Did God flash the words before your eyes? What does God's voice sound like? And I think the problem in a way is that God's voice sounds to us like our own internal voice. It's just saying something that our own internal voice would not say. So one of the ways I most often think about God speaking to me in words, so to speak, it in a way, is when an idea enters my head that has not been there before, and yet makes sense. A nudge to phone somebody, a nudge to send somebody a pamphlet or write somebody an email, somebody who somebody I wasn't thinking about, something that was not on my mind when I entered into my time of prayer or silence, something that comes out of nowhere. My friend Bill Tabor writes about a phrase that came to him one year, I think either on Christmas or New Year's. He had been with his family all day, and then he went upstairs and opened his journal to try to figure out what God wanted him to do in the coming year. He was thinking in terms of ministry. He was thinking in terms of tasks, wondering what he should focus on. And something came to him and said, you need to learn to accept the cross of joy. This phrase of the cross of joy was nothing he had ever heard, was not an idea he had had before, and he tried to understand it. And as he understood it, what it meant to him was the idea that God was using all things, his flat tire, the rain, the things that seemed to make his life miserable sometimes, that God had a use for those things, and to accept what came to him with equanimity. And to embrace joy where he found it. We could also think about our kind of favorite Quaker saints in the Wilmington area, Isaac and Sarah Harvey. A story maddening in its lack of details, but insofar as we know what happened, Isaac was plowing in the field and heard a voice say to him, "Thee must go to Washington, D.C. to speak to the president." I am pretty sure that we could say that speaking to the president had not been on Isaac's to-do list that morning, or any morning. We can also be pretty sure that he was aware of the Civil War that was going on. He was aware with what the situation with slavery was. He was not ignorant or innocent of the world. So the fact that something might come into his head saying, you should go speak to the president, while completely unexpected was not completely senseless. And so he went home, and his wife said, "What are you doing?" Sarah said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I must go speak to the president." She said, "Who sends thee?" He said, "The Lord sends me." She said, "I will go with you." And they got on a train and they went to Washington, D.C. And they spoke to the president. Miraculously, actually. It would be hard to characterize what voice that was, but I suspect that it sounded to Isaac like any of his inner thoughts might have sounded, but it was completely unexpected and yet in keeping with what he knew that God might do. John Woolman used to speak about, and then I felt a motion of love. So I think what he was saying there, I felt a motion of love to visit the Indians. I felt a motion of love to travel among the slaveholders, was that there was something that rose in him, an idea to do something, but it was first motivated by love. He didn't go to visit slaveholders out of anger. He went for a concern for their own condition. Again, in this issue on discernment in Quaker life that I keep talking about, a woman named Linda Ladwig, who was pastor for many years of Whittier Friends, has written about an experience that she had in leading their youth group. And every year their youth group would bake candy around the time of Christmas and have a candy sale. Half of the proceeds would go towards the youth group, and half of the proceeds would go towards some concern or charity, and the youth group got to decide what it went to. And in this particular year, one of the girls in the youth group brought to the youth a concern for something called the Navajo Water Project. And it was, it is still going on, but an organization that helps the Navajo in the area of the United States where they are access clean drinking water and water for other uses, because much of that area has absolutely no running water. And so if they are not able to dig wells in an area, they will actually install water tanks, and then a water truck will come around and fill the tanks. So Linda heard this concern, and it was something that she had never heard about before. She started to do research, and she became more and more amazed and upset with herself that this kind of poverty and this lack of access to water could be happening so close to where she was, and that she had never heard about it, even though she had heard about clean water projects in Africa and in other parts of the world, that right here, one state or two states away from her, there were people who had no access to water, and she was completely unaware of it. And so the youth that year did decide to donate half of their candy proceeds to the Navajo Water Project. But in addition, they created a youth mission trip in the summer, which also involved many of the adults in the meeting. And a large part of the meeting went to the four-state area and visited among the Navajo and saw the water tanks, accompanied the water tank woman on her rounds, and helped with some other work there. And that's the kind of voice from God that happens when someone else's concern becomes your concern. When you hear God's voice and someone else's voice, this was something Linda had known absolutely nothing about. And it became a deep concern of hers, an ongoing concern of hers, that the Navajo had no access to water. Another thing that makes a difference in this listening to God's voice and trying to distinguish it from, so this thought that's come into my head, is it actually God's voice, or is it just a fleeting thought, a moment of inspiration, but it doesn't carry any real import? One way to discern if this is God's voice is this persistent? Does it carry on over time? If I have been asked to write something called Living with the Body of Christ, the Field Guide to Quaker Process, is that just a momentary blip on my consciousness, or is it something I have to pay attention to? How long does it persist? Sometimes God's voice is knowing what to do. When I first started to attend a friend's meeting in Pittsburgh, one of the things that most amazed me and that I most wanted was the sense that the people that I was among knew what to do when it came to caring for other people. And I remember a man named Michael who was having to move away from Pittsburgh, and he was telling a small group that he was having to move away, and how much he was going to miss the meeting and how much he was going to miss Pittsburgh. And he started to cry as he was talking. He was standing in the middle of a room with this small group, and he just started to cry. He just started to weep. And someone immediately got up and walked across the room to him and hugged him. A gesture which to me at that time would have been unthinkable and certainly would never have occurred to me. And I think that was the voice of God. That knowing what to do, and certainly also a motion of love. I think it is important for us to look back on our lives, to reflect on our lives, and to see where and how God has spoken to us. What means God has used, to recognize and name those places. Because the way that we live together as friends demands that we know when God is speaking. And I think that for others, as for me, the idea of God's voice is an obstacle. The very word voice, because you want to say, what does it sound like? And the reality, I think, is it sounds like our internal voice, or it sounds like somebody else's voice. It sounds like the voice of someone across the room. It sounds like something I read in a book. But it resonates as God's voice resonates. I think a continuing inventory of how and where and whether we're hearing God's voice is a necessity for living with each other in love.